Thank you so much, Dimitri. I'm really honored to be speaking on this platform because of all the amazing women speakers who have been here before me. And I like to believe that the project we're all working on is really about changing the stories we tell about Black artists. And I very much appreciate their contributions to this conversation. Um, and to those of you who are joining us for this conversation. Um, I believe that I believe in my role to work across continents, and the work that I do in different contexts can have resonance anywhere. Institutions such as MoAD exemplifies the resonances that Black artists and their work have across the world. So it's a special honor for me to be here today. And I would like to give a warm thank you to Manetta White and once again to Dimitri Broxton for this wonderful opportunity. My entire purview of art history has been altered by my engagement with African artists, and especially how those artists and their artworks enable the articulation of other trajectories of thought, other ways of relating to the world, and of relating to others. Their work enables the reading of other aesthetics and of questions about the politics of representation to be part of the experience of the arts, even as critical aspects of their work are often made invisible or irrelevant through various art historical frameworks. So, this talk is really an opportunity to think about two artists who are currently on exhibition at MoAD and to begin to just pose some uh, um, propositions that I'm excited to delve deeper into. But you know, really felt excited to be able to put down some thoughts, especially since these are things that I've been thinking about for a long time. So much has been written about the artists Amoako, Boafo, and Billie Zangewa. Most of this work focuses on the artist's meteoric rise in the art world, or their techniques for making art, or their identities as Black or African. More important, however, is that the terms around which their work is framed is limiting for their art and for the questions we ask about it and the knowledge we can learn from it. To counter these approaches, it's essential for us to examine artists' practices, the references they use, and the questions they raise, as well as the spaces of thought that their work opens up. And their work has certainly opened up this space of thinking that I'm sharing today. And I appreciate this opportunity once again to recover and share what I think are the critical elements in Boafo and Zangewa's work, namely the way in which both artists are opening up new critical possibilities, specifically the ways in which both artists are overcoming the modern/colonial gaze and transgressing racialized and gendered norms. So let's step back for a minute and let me unpack a little bit what I mean by modern colonial gaze and race and gender norms. So, modernity/coloniality is a concept that was first used by the theorist Annibale Cujano and later developed by Walter Mignolo. It refers to ways in which these concepts, modernity, coloniality, are inseparable, hence the slash between the two words. They are two sides of the same coin. Many brilliant scholars have traced the birth of the concept of a sovereign subject or a single author back to the Renaissance and to the emergence of the portrait as a genre. This author, this single subject, has mostly been uh, white Christian male author. If you think for a minute about any portrait from the Renaissance throughout the history of Western art, and you ask yourself, who is being seen, who has the power to see, who represents, who is represented, these types of questions reveal who the sovereign, the imperial subject of perception is. And we can see inside of it how a standard subject was formed through artistic representation. The construction of this individual self became normal and defined by the given name of author and the portrayed self, or artist and the portrayed self. And this process, which I'm really simplifying or trying to, um, was referred to as a process of individuation. And it is an important part of the process of establishing this white gaze. Now, a parallel development emerged alongside of the emergence of this self, and that is ways of representing not just the self, but also the world. So these mostly Christian, white, male selves and authors started to draw the world in perspective. The Renaissance perspective, for instance, both requires and expresses the main point of the white gaze. And this created a theory of knowledge in which the world comes to be represented from that singular perspective, a singular perspective of the self. This idea and this concept of the white gaze carries a whole kind of metaphysical presence. Time is often reduced to space, and the surface of representation, the surface of a painting, for instance, becomes the standard of reality. More importantly, is that what we are perceiving when we look at the standard portrait is also the portrait's gaze, the portrait's own gaze. And in that gaze, the portrait affirms its supreme power over visibility, as much as it establishes its imperial power over representation. We are taught to look at the world and to look at ourselves through their eyes. Perception and representation become coextensive. Both Renaissance portraits and Renaissance perspective are sort of visual method, kind of visual education that had the power to establish what is described as the modern subject and modernity's worldview. As I would add, what a lot of decolonial scholars have argued is that this visual method reproduced and or had the effect of erasing coloniality. So we only saw this one side of modernity. We don't see the other side of it, namely coloniality. So in other words, what they argue is that it erased the exploitation of the world and its resources by European systems of domination. This dynamic is present in the history of art, this dynamic which I've sketched out, and stretches from colonial landscape painting to primitivism. In all these streams of art, the power of the singular white gaze is present, and this is what a lot of decolonial scholarship and even post-colonial scholarship, as well as feminist scholarship, has unpacked, identified and unpacked and deconstructed. But in these streams of art, the power of the singular white gaze is present, and this is how the white gaze becomes formed. It creates its own universe while it is creating itself as a canon. Now, decolonial scholars have argued that seeing from that singular perspective becomes an enclosure. Within that enclosure is a monocultural, singular history of a single cultures, um, and and that also becomes an enclosure for the history of perception, for how we see. But the white gaze is also gendered. It is predominantly masculine and constitutes the standard subject, the standard self, as masculine. So, in this framework of a modern slash colonial order, to become masculine means to be someone, and to be someone who is engaged and who participates in the violent consumption of the other. And this brings us to a crucial issue. And that issue is that these aesthetic formations, or these concepts which find themselves articulated in aesthetic formations, these formations, this kind of aesthetics is dominated by this white male gaze and is loaded with this violence of modernity slash coloniality. So, beauty, for instance, as a form of enjoyment in modern life, is often implicated in the suffering of others. Notions or genres like the colonial landscape, exoticides, nudes of racialized women, and the aesthetic appropriation of primitivism are all articulations of this consuming of coloniality as aesthetics, consuming of coloniality as art. Now, a decolonial and feminist perspective calls for targeting two different kinds of exclusions that occurs in this process I've been sketching. So, targeting these two different kinds of exclusions, that of the white male gaze that excludes, and that of the representation itself that excludes. And so the way to target these kinds of exclusions, they've argued, is by overcoming that gaze, that modern colonial gaze, B, refusing to be framed by the structural violence and power differentials that constitutes the gender binary. So refusing that kind of patriarchal construction of, gender. And so by now you might be wondering, what all of this has to do with Boafo and Billie Zangewa. And we'll come to that in a moment, because it's against that backdrop that I think, or that I'm suggesting, their work opens up these new critical possibilities for overcoming that gaze and for refusing to be framed by the violence of the colonial and the post-colonial. So there's a statement by Saidiya Hartman, where she's writing and talking about the work of the artist Simone Lee, that I think is equally true for the artists currently under discussion for Boafo and Zangewa. And I'm going to quote her statement. Their hands have created a world, have disrupted and evaded the dominant economy of the gaze, not by opposition or protest, not by explaining anything, but by looking otherwise, by retreating within, by a radical withholding that makes visible and palpable all that is held in reserve. All that power love, brilliance, labor, and care. All that beauty. End quote. And as these images of the artist's work sort of wash over us, I also want those words to, wash over us, because therein kind of lies this, key to this kind of criticality that I'm, sort of moving towards. Billie Zangewa's early cityscapes located her position as a woman, as a city dweller, as an object of public desire. Later, the focus of her intricate compositions shifted to self-portraiture and self-representation. After the birth of her son, her hand-stitched collages shifted once more towards motherhood and the work of being a parent. Each shift was marked by a distinct change in the artist's relationship to the gaze. The first was feeling subjected to it, objectified by it. In the second shift, she discovers the power of returning the female gaze. And in the third and current shift, she directs our gaze towards love. Zangewa has often remarked that she wants her work to open up a dialogue about Black women and their experiences, to open up the silences, and to share intimacies. She speaks of a daily feminism, and that the ultimate act of resistance to patriarchy, to history, to the present, to self, is to representation, is self-love. In this, I was reminded of Bell Hooks, the brilliant thinker, activist, feminist, theorist who passed away and left us all too soon last year. But Bell Hooks took seriously this idea that social change had to center love, and that this was as much about transforming ourselves as it was about changing the world. In her 1999 book, All About Love, New Visions, she focused on the importance of love, community, and self-care, not as escapism or as distraction, but as an essential part of changing the world. She argued that we cannot continue to hurt, to undermine, and belittle each other and simultaneously build a better society. In fact, she said, whenever domination is present, love is lacking. She wrote that in 2000 publication book, Feminism is for Everybody. I see in Zangewa's artwork, in what she calls her visual diaries, an act of self-historicization, writing herself into history through a practice of care. Staging, composing, cutting, sewing, applying layer upon layer of silk is a meditative, healing, and caring process. Visually, that complex layering creates what the brilliant scholar Henry Louis Gates has described as the multiplicity of multiplicity, which is less about identity and more about the politics that she's establishing through her work, this multidimensionality, this, multiple layers of complexity. And then there are also these fascinating cutout spaces at the edges of Zangewa's silk memories. And I think of these as reminders that we live in a time where the historical record in our culture is so incomplete when it comes to Black women, to Black artists, that it has to be supplemented, even supplanted, by remembered stories, by memories. And so, as much as the compositions reveal these memories, they also reveal these absences in the historical record. Drawing since childhood, Boafo took to painting and figuration. Much has been said about the artist's celebration of blackness by the artist himself. But like Zangewa, Boafo's striking portraits have a crucial relationship to the gaze. The direct gaze in my paintings, he says, makes this person look back at you. You stare at the painting and someone stares back at you. That might not be very comfortable for you. It means when you're analyzing the painting is analyzing you. Close quote. Boafo encourages a different way of looking, and in so doing has opened up a whole new trajectory and a new set of possibilities within figurative portraiture. Those swirls of brown paint created by his singular finger painting style and applied to faces and exposed body parts of his subjects make visible a complex interiority, a complex inside within his subjects, even as they gaze outward toward the world. This interiority and exteriority of Boafo's subjects, all of whom are familiar, friendly, in community with the artist, holds a kind of intimacy too, and a capacity for self possession, self awareness, and self fullness, similar to what the American soul and jazz poet Gil Scott Heron recited in his spoken word poetry. And I quote, I did not become someone different that I did not want to be. In the context of Boafo's portraits, black interiority speaks to the inner aliveness of a people and the expressive cultural production that they shape. And here we can think of the patterning, the wallpapers, the interior backdrops of, of pops of color as that expressive cultural production. At the same time, I would argue, or at least pursue this line of argument, that Boafo's subjects are also situated outside in the material world, the world of bright color and patterned fabrics and shadows. The black body is not constrained by this binary of interior-exterior, nor is it divorced from the political or from public life. In fact, the interiority of the subject, which is often seen as a protection from the outside world, I think in his pictures, this interiorness that we see in the figures proclaims its own sovereignty. Now, remember, we talked about the sovereign self and the imperial self, and as this counterpoint to that gaze, to that construction of self, is maybe not a counterpoint, but another trajectory, another tributary, another stream to that is the subject who proclaims its own sovereignty within that interiority. So there's room for real feelings between them and us in a real world. And I love how both Billie Zangewa and Boafo capture this range of figures and relations and relationships and moments within their work. But let's imagine for a moment that Boafo and Zangewa are decolonial feminist thinkers who respect and who understand the importance of post-colonial articulations, but that they want to say something different. And if so, we only need to ask a few very simple but fundamental questions about their artwork to reveal the incredible possibilities for reading other aesthetic trajectories and for valuing their different qualities of art making. Who is looking? Who is being seen? Who is being represented? And who is doing the representing? What I think the artists want to say is this: we want to have the right to recognize other trajectories of thought, other ways of relating to being, in, and sensing our world, and of relating to others in a pluriversal manner. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to discussing these ideas more in the discussion part of this talk. Thank you.